So one of the trends that it's quite clear is that convergence will continue in the sense that developing countries are going to be the main sources of growth. And we are talking not only about the Chinas, Indias, Brazils, we are also talking about Africa. And I would argue this is good news for the world economy in the sense that convergence and inequality in terms of income distribution at world level are going, convergence is going to increase and inequality is going to decrease. But at the same time, and this is associated to the first point that I made about the structural change, we see inequality, particularly in OECD countries, increasing. And this, of course, raises very significant policy questions.
Do you mean inequality within a country or between countries?
I said that inequality between countries, so at the international level, is decreasing because developing countries, yes, we project, for instance, that on average are going to grow between 4.5 and 5% for the next 10 years, while industrialized countries at most at the level of 2%. So if we are talking international inequality is decreasing. And this, of course, has to do particularly with the situation of the growth in China, India, Brazil, and the diminution in poverty of these countries. Now, inequality in OECD countries, within, in many, not all, is increasing. And this is associated with the first point that I made about structural change. Because if we look, let's take one country, for instance, and Stefano has provided the whole picture in terms of how OECD economies have been faring during the crisis. And we'll have a chance later to talk a little bit about policies, about rigidities in labor markets, etc. But there is one country that often people point as an example of where labor markets are very flexible, and contrasts, for instance, with the situation of countries like Spain, where we saw the levels of unemployment. And this country is the United States. Yet, if we look at the United States, and we look at, let's say, the linkage between growth and job creation over the last 30 years or so, if we compare 1990 with 2008, it is true that the job creation machine, so to say, in the United States was very powerful. It created something like 27 million jobs over these almost 30 years, 99 till 2008, so immediately before the crisis hit the economy. But if we ask where these jobs were created, 98% of the jobs were created in the non-tradable sector. So services, particularly government, and health services. And these were very dynamic, but it's important to understand what is going on. What is going on is, as the world economy becomes more integrated, as competition from countries like China, in the case of manufactured products, tradable services for India, agriculture from Brazil increases, of course, you have an inevitable change in the structure of the economy, and you're gonna see more jobs in the non-tradable sectors, and particularly in those that are high value added. And this is natural, but at the same time, it contributes to an increase in the inequality in the economy, because those jobs that are low value added are under growing competition. And this, of course, if we just remember that only 2% of the job creation in the United States was associated with new jobs, I'm talking about net creation of jobs, in the manufactured product sector, and tradable services like financial services, then you see a structure that is increasing dramatically the premium to non-tradable in terms of allocation, and to high value-added services. So those that are highly educated are having a significant return on their investments in education. Actually, another way to look at this, if we look value-added in terms of a given sector, because value-added in the end is return to capital and to labor. And if you ask where the growth comes, the growth is coming mainly exactly in the high value-added sector. And this has implications for income distribution. Now, how you respond to this, not for a moment I'm suggesting that trade protectionism is the solution. Actually, it would only make things worse. But it's something that we have to keep in mind to understand what is going on. There is a structural change. This structural change is associated with globalization. If on top of that you have a major macroeconomic shock as the one that we saw over the last 3 years, no doubt this creates many questions about how growth and jobs are going to be connected in the future. Even as we come out of the recession, these structural changes are here to stay with us. Just to finalize the other 2 points, I guess I made 2, so the other 3 points very quickly in terms of what is going to happen with respect to the rest of the world. First, if we look at developing countries during the recession, one thing that was very impressive was the resilience of developing economies through the crisis. Most developing economies, and even countries like Turkey that you have seen data, and also Mexico to a certain extent, were able to rebound very quickly. Actually, you could argue, well, in the case of Africa, for instance, these countries were much less integrated in the financial sector, the epicenter of the shock. But this is not good enough, because in the past, we have seen these economies dramatically affected by the impact of a world recession. This time it was much less so. Why is that so? Well, because they had much better macroeconomic policies coming into the crisis. They, in some cases, particularly low-income economies, had significantly benefited from debt relief in the case of the heavily indebted poor countries. Just to give an idea, in 1999, these countries paid roughly 20% of their export revenues to service the debt. Nowadays, they pay around 5%. Why? Because of debt relief. So all of this greatly improved their capacity to withstand the shock, and they fare much better. Having said that, the lowest parts of society were significantly affected. And this is my last point, the importance of having social safety nets to cope with these issues. And this immediately takes us to my really last point, the situation in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, and how can we understand what is going on in the region associated with these external shocks, associated with youth unemployment, and the importance of a new social contract to address these concerns. Something that I'll come back in the second round if I have a chance.
This is very important. I remember in Davos 3 years ago, when an American demographer was saying, look at the demographic dynamic in the MENA countries is where the revolution will start. I was really very impressed by that prediction, but actually, as you know, demographic trends are already with us, and it's very easy to predict these kind of problems. But now let's look at the Eastern European countries, and I already have a potential question for you. You may decide to do it, to answer later. As Carlos said, we call this period the Great Recession, not the Great Depression, like in the 30s. And why is that? Well, maybe because we have not yet seen the depression of people, the mental depression. But we know from some studies that being unemployed can create a permanent impact on people's happiness or well-being and so on. And the Eastern European countries came out of the big change, the big shock they had after the end of the communism, with a lot of people that were depressed. So my question is are Eastern countries going to face a similar situation? I hope not, of course. But you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank you for the invitation, and I start with apologizing for speaking English in such a splendid setting. It would be much more appropriate to speak the local language, but since we're talking about a serious subject, it's quite appropriate probably to switch to English. To your question, I think one issue that's really quite interesting, that because the Central and Eastern European countries, this wasn't their first crisis. They had a crisis of transformation in the 90s. Some of them actually proved to be more resilient for that reason, because to them it wasn't really the worst that had happened yet. Some of them really had sort of more serious problems in the 90s.